A walled space filled with elaborate stone structures, underground chambers, and carved symbols that nobody teaches you to read anymore. You were told it is where they put the dead. You were told the fences and the locked gates exist to protect the grave inside. You were told the obelisks are grief monuments, and the underground vaults are burial chambers, and the sophisticated drainage systems are sanitation infrastructure, and the elevated positions on the highest ground in the urban core are just where there happened to be space. You were told all of this so thoroughly and so early that you stopped seeing what is actually there. You walk past those walls every day and you do not look twice because you already know what a cemetery is, except you do not. Not really, because when you stop accepting the explanation and start looking at the physical evidence, the engineering, the positioning, the symbolism, the underground architecture, the scale, none of it matches the story you were given. The dead do not need ventilation systems. The dead do not need sophisticated drainage infrastructure. The dead do not need commanding elevated views of the city skyline or precisely engineered underground chambers built to standards that modern restoration engineers describe as extraordinary. The dead do not need any of that, but someone built it anyway. And someone decided that the best way to make sure you never asked why was to tell you it was for the dead. Because once a space belongs to the dead, the living stop asking questions about it. They treat it with reverence. They leave it alone. They maintain it without understanding what they are maintaining, and the walls stay locked, and the obelisks keep standing, and the underground chambers stay ventilated, and the story keeps working exactly as it was designed to work. This video is about what those spaces actually are, and why someone needed you to believe they were something else. Walk into any old cemetery in any major city and do something most people never do. Stop accepting the explanation and start looking at what is physically in front of you. The structures are enormous. Not enormous in the way that a grand public building is enormous because someone wanted to impress visitors. Enormous in the way that something built to last centuries is enormous. The stonework is precise in a way that modern construction crews working with contemporary tools and materials struggle to replicate when they attempt restoration. The underground vaults are ventilated. Not accidentally ventilated through gaps in old masonry, but deliberately ventilated through engineered systems designed to maintain specific temperature and humidity conditions, regardless of what the weather is doing above ground. The drainage systems built into the foundations of the major mausoleum complexes are sophisticated enough that engineers encountering them during restoration work in the 20th and 21st centuries have documented their surprise at the quality. The architecture of the above-ground mausoleums uses columns and arches and proportional systems that match the grand public buildings of the same era exactly, not approximately, exactly, the same column heights relative to base widths, the same arch radii, the same relationship between solid and void that appears in the train stations and courthouses and civic halls built in the same decades. And the symbolism carved into every surface is not random grief iconography chosen by bereaved families trying to express loss. It is a coherent visual language that repeats with remarkable consistency across cemeteries in different cities in different countries built by different communities with no apparent coordination. Obelisks, torches, all-seeing eyes, hands pointing skyward, anchors, broken columns, inverted torches, clasped hands. These symbols appear again and again with the consistency of a vocabulary. Not the improvised grief of individual families, but a shared language being spoken by whoever was designing these spaces. In nearly every major city, the oldest and grandest cemetery sits on some of the most strategically valuable land in the urban landscape. This is not coincidence, and it is not explained by the official history of these spaces. Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn covers 478 acres. Its hills offer what were, before skyscrapers changed the skyline, some of the finest elevated views of New York Harbor available from anywhere in the borough. During the Civil War, Union forces immediately recognized the strategic value of Greenwood's high ground and positioned artillery there. Military engineers know commanding ground when they see it. Greenwood's founders knew it too, decades before the war, when they chose that specific location for what they said was a burial ground. Highgate Cemetery in London sits on a hillside in one of the most desirable and elevated areas of North London. The views from its upper sections extend across the city in multiple directions. Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts covers 175 acres of the most elevated terrain in the immediate Boston area. Père Lachaise in Paris covers over 100 acres in an elevated position within the city. Every one of these spaces sits on high ground. Every one of them offers sweeping views in multiple directions. Every one of them was established in the same compressed period, between roughly 1804 and 1840, as part of what historians call the rural cemetery movement. A military engineer looking at a map of any major Western city and identifying the most strategically significant high ground positions would find, in nearly every case, that those positions are occupied by cemeteries. cemeteries that were established in a 30-year window in the early 19th century on land that any competent military or civic planner would have immediately recognized as commanding ground. Before approximately 1820, the dead in Western cities were buried in churchyards. Small spaces, urban, crowded, directly integrated into the fabric of city life in a way that meant the dead and the living shared the same neighborhoods. The new rural cemetery movement changed this completely, and it changed it very fast. Père Lachaise opened in Paris in 1804, Mount Auburn in Cambridge in 1831, Greenwood in Brooklyn in 1838, Highgate in London in 1839, Laurel Hill in Philadelphia in 1836. Spring Grove in Cincinnati in 1845. Within 40 years, every major city in the Western world had established at least one of these grand new burial grounds on the urban periphery. The official explanation is sanitation. Cities were growing rapidly. The old churchyard burial grounds were overcrowded. The decomposing dead were a genuine public health problem in dense urban environments. Moving burial outside the city to purpose-built landscaped spaces was a rational response to a real problem. This explanation is true as far as it goes, but it does not explain what was actually built. No public health reformer designing a solution to the problem of urban overcrowding of burial grounds would build terraced amphitheaters. No sanitation engineer would specify Egyptian revival entrance gates with columns proportioned to match ancient temple architecture. No practical solution to the problem of decomposing bodies requires underground catacombs with vaulted brick ceilings engineered to maintain constant humidity. No rational response to churchyard overcrowding demands cast iron fountains fed by internal spring systems, or drainage infrastructure built to standards that would be expensive and technically demanding even today. The official explanation accounts for why new burial spaces were needed. It does not account for what was built once the decision was made to build them. The single most common large monument form in Western cemeteries is the obelisk. There are estimated to be hundreds of thousands of obelisk grave markers in American cemeteries alone. In any large 19th century cemetery, you can stand at an elevated point and count dozens of them rising above the treeline in every direction. The official explanation is fashion. The Egyptian revival style became popular in the Western world following Napoleon's Egyptian campaign in the late 18th century. People were fascinated by ancient Egypt. The obelisk was a visually striking form. It became fashionable for funerary monuments. People used it because they liked how it looked. This explanation has a problem. The ancient Egyptians did not put obelisks on graves. This is not a debated point. It is straightforward Egyptological fact. The Egyptian obelisk was placed at the entrance to temples. It was erected in pairs at the thresholds of sacred spaces. It was a marker of entry into a place of power and divine presence. It was never a marker of individual death or personal commemoration in the Egyptian tradition that supposedly inspired its use. So the Victorian world took an architectural form that older civilizations had reserved specifically for the entrances to sacred gathering spaces and decided to use it as the standard form for individual grave markers. Not occasionally, hundreds of thousands of times, across every city in the Western world simultaneously. The question the Tartarian framework asks is not why this form was fashionable. The question is why a civilization undergoing a major cultural transition would so consistently reach for this specific form. The temple entrance marker, the threshold indicator, the sign of sacred gathering ground. When it needed to mark the spaces, it was building on strategically elevated urban land with sophisticated underground infrastructure. Many of the grand 19th century cemeteries contain extensive underground systems. Some are explained as catacombs, spaces for above-ground interment in vaulted chambers. But the engineering consistently exceeds any burial function by a margin that is difficult to explain within the official framework. The catacombs at Highgate Cemetery in London maintain a specific temperature and humidity range that has been documented by restoration engineers as remarkably stable regardless of external weather conditions. The ventilation systems responsible for this stability were built into the original construction. They were not added later. They were part of the design from the beginning. The drainage systems built into the foundation structures of major mausoleum complexes across American and European cemeteries are sophisticated enough that modern engineers encountering them describe their quality as unexpected for the period, not unexpected for any period. Unexpected specifically because the official account of when and why these spaces were built does not provide a reason for that level of engineering investment. Foundation systems in several American rural cemetery underground chambers were built with technical specifications that would have been expensive and demanding even by contemporary construction standards, far beyond anything necessary simply to provide a slightly more elegant resting place for human remains. When you ask what these underground spaces were actually built for within the Tartarian framework, several possibilities present themselves. Preservation of material artifacts from a civilization undergoing deliberate erasure. Continuation of pre-existing infrastructure systems, particularly water management and distribution, that served the surrounding community in ways no longer officially acknowledged. Or something related to the energy system theories, the idea that these underground chambers were part of a larger network of infrastructure that the pre-reset civilization had built into the landscape, and that someone in the transition period needed to maintain even as its original function was being buried under new explanations. Before the cemetery reform movement of the 19th century, public space in cities was limited and increasingly controlled. The church controlled the churchyard. The wealthy controlled the parks. The commons of Britain were being enclosed through exactly the same period that the rural cemetery movement was establishing its grand new spaces. Ordinary people had fewer and fewer places where they could gather in large numbers without being subject to commercial transaction or institutional supervision. When the large rural cemetery was first introduced to the public, it was presented explicitly as a park as much as a burial ground. Mount Auburn Cemetery's founders described it as a pleasure ground where citizens could walk, contemplate, and gather in a designed natural landscape. In the first decades of these spaces, they functioned exactly as described, drawing thousands of visitors weekly who came not to visit specific grave, but simply to be in a beautifully maintained open landscape. They were gathering grounds, documented, explicitly acknowledged, functioning gathering grounds. Alternative history reading of this is that the gathering was not an incidental feature of the rural cemetery movement. It was the original function of these spaces, predating the cemetery narrative entirely, that the spaces existed as gathering grounds before they were officially established as cemeteries, and that the cemetery framework was the mechanism chosen to ensure they would be maintained and protected through the transition between the civilization that built them and the civilization that came after. Once a space is associated with sacred burial, the surrounding population's instinct is to protect it, maintain it, and not disturb it. The elaborate structures remain intact, the sites remain funded, the underground infrastructure continues to function, and nobody asks what any of it was originally for because everyone already knows what a cemetery is. The cemetery reform movement of the 1820s through the 1840s coincides precisely with the period that alternative history researchers identify as the active transition phase of the civilization reset. The 1820s and 1830s are the decades when the grand architecture of the previous civilization was being rapidly repurposed and rebranded throughout the Western world. Universities were being moved into buildings that were clearly already standing. Public institutions were being established inside structures that official histories describe as newly built, but that show physical evidence of much earlier construction. The cities of America in particular were being organized around an infrastructure that appears to have already existed in substantial part rather than being assembled from nothing by pioneer populations with hand tools and animal power. The Tartarian framework asks a simple question about this period. If the civilization before ours built grand stone architecture across the world, and if that civilization was being erased and replaced during this period, what happened to the buildings? Some were incorporated into the new institutional framework with new official histories attached to them. Some were demolished, and some, the argument goes, were rebranded as cemeteries. The rebranding was elegant in its logic. A space reframed as a burial ground becomes self-protecting. The new population maintains it out of reverence for their own dead, without understanding that the structures they are tending predate their presence on the land. The obelisks keep standing because they are grave markers. The underground chambers stay sealed because they are burial vaults. The elevated positions stay clear because they are sacred ground. And the original function of all of it, whatever it was, continues undisturbed beneath the layer of meaning that was placed over it. The walls of a cemetery are explained as boundaries. They mark the sacred space of the dead and separate it from the mundane space of the living. They keep the outside world from intruding on the quiet of the burial ground. This explanation is so culturally embedded that it feels like common sense rather than interpretation. But consider it directly. Walls keep things in or they keep things out. The dead do not need to be kept in. Whatever spiritual framework you hold about the nature of death, the physical remains of the deceased have never been documented attempting to leave a cemetery. The walls are not for the dead. The walls are for you. They mark the boundary of a space you are not supposed to examine too closely. They are the physical implementation of the same instruction that the official narrative delivers verbally. This space belongs to the dead. You already know what it is. There is nothing here that requires your investigation. Walk past, the obelisks are still standing in every cemetery in every major city in the world. The underground chambers are still ventilated. The drainage still functions. The elevated positions still offer commanding views of the surrounding urban landscape. The sophisticated stonework is still more precise than modern restoration crews expect when they encounter it. None of this was built for the dead. The dead do not need ventilation. The dead do not need drainage. The dead do not need commanding views. The dead do not need precision stonework engineered to last for centuries. Someone built these spaces for the living, and built them with a level of care and technical sophistication that vastly exceeds any burial requirement. And someone else, in a specific compressed period between roughly 1804 and 1840, decided that the best way to ensure these spaces would be maintained without being understood was to tell the incoming population that they belonged to the dead. The story has been working ever since. The walls are still locked. The next time you walk past one, look at what is on the other side of it. Not grave, infrastructure, architecture, elevated ground with sweeping views. Underground chambers with sophisticated ventilation. Obelisks that ancient civilizations placed at the entrances to sacred gathering spaces. And walls that were built not to keep the dead in, but to keep you from asking what any of it was actually for.